I'm going to start with a short presentation, and then we're going to look at adding some examples in Formpak. So we're going to be looking at various data sources for adding raw materials, the parameters we might add, certification, non-regulatory properties that may be of interest, properties such as GHS hazards and CLP hazards, and the composition of a raw material, physical versus regulatory. So the CLP regulation of the EU, and the GB version is very much the same, states that downstream users of a chemical substance or mixture shall identify relevant available information for the purposes of determining whether the substance mixture entails a physical, human health or environmental hazard. And what this means is that all people in the supply chain have responsibility for their own products that they use and place on the market, and they cannot just blindly rely on the data from their supplier. Although supplier data can be a good source, it's not a defense to just say the reason I classified it is because that's what they said. So it's good practice to look at all available data sources. And your supplier safety data sheet is usually a good source. And the safety data sheet is split into 16 sections. Usually, a lot of these contain fairly generic information. For example, first aid measures and firefighting measures, they're all fairly standard. But the best sort of information about an individual raw material usually comes from the hazards identification, the composition, if there is one, and the physical and chemical properties. Sections 2, 3, and 9. Other available data sources for our industries and related industries: the International Fragrance Association, IFRA, and the International Organization of the Flavor Industry, IOFI, invest in reviewing available test data and making expert judgment for the most reliable classification for the members of the associations. Once a customer has requested access from IFRA IOFI, Formpak makes the labelling manual data available, typically as an original data set of raw materials for a new system. And then there's an optional annual chargeable data import. These raw materials typically are best used as reference data rather than a representative of physical raw materials, but either is possible. Some chemicals have a harmonized classification, which is described in Annex 6 of CLP. This is a mandatory minimum classification which everyone must use, and examples include limonene, acetaldehyde, and nicotine. The European Chemicals Agency holds much data submitted for REACH registrations, and also the classification and labelling inventory. Although it must be said that this latter inventory was created by chemical users, and so it's not reviewed data, and some of it is potentially spurious. Copy from existing. So in Formpak, it's possible, if you have a raw material already in your system, it's possible to create a new version of it from copy from existing, and this is available when you add a new raw material. It's not possible when modifying an existing raw material. The reasons for doing this could be that maybe you want a different grade of an essential oil or chemical, and so you make two versions and then make slight changes if necessary to the new version. Parameters. So when we add a new raw material, there's various parameters we might want to consider. Item class. So this is useful. There are some item classes already set up in your Formpak system when it's new, but it's possible to add new item classes if you want to represent different sorts of raw materials and indeed formulations within your system. This enables a variety of search functionality, and you can even have properties calculating differently for different item classes. Availability, this is useful for purchasing, and this controls it reflects how easily obtainable a raw material is. This data is likely to change quite often, so you typically requires updating fairly regularly. Use in complex raw materials. This is a checkbox on the key details tab, and this determines whether the raw material can or cannot be used as a composition item in another raw material. All raw materials are able to be used in formulations, assuming that they are a permitted item class. But for raw materials, you can choose whether it's allowed to be used in the composition of another raw material. Typically, raw materials are set to yes, but there are occasions where you maybe don't want to allow certain raw materials. Cost. This is how much physical raw materials cost. This is likely to change quite often. Preserve when exploding is a fairly niche regulatory option. It's nearly always set to no. It's rarely used when you need to have multiple layers of regulatory composition. So for example, if you have a physical lemongrass oil that contains regulatory geraniol and nerol, the regulatory geraniol and nerol are treated as separate chemicals, but the IFRA limits for citral need to apply to both. So therefore, the geraniol and nerol must be preserved in order to show their different hazards, but also have an accumulation composition to accumulate the IFRA hazard together. Certification. So it may be that your raw material has a certificate from the supplier to state that it's organic or halal or kosher, and it's possible to upload the certificate into Formpak on a specific raw material, and it's also possible to set an expiry date. Typically the certificates for these sorts of things are time limited, possibly 1 or 2 years, and so you can set an expiry date on the raw material, and then you'll know when recertification is required. Non-regulatory. So much of the data that we need to apply to raw materials is regulatory data. However, some non-regulatory data which could be useful to other departments in the business are character class and character notes. So these are useful for evaluation departments that are maybe selecting answers to projects from the library instead of having a flavorist or a perfumer create new versions all the time. And these are all user defined. So a fragrance company might want to add character class and notes to represent the odor, whereas a flavor company may want to include them as taste or mouthfeel or any number of parameters. It's also useful in as much you can search using find matching items. You can search for character class and notes. So if you're looking for particular items and how they smell, then this is what's to use. GHS and CLP properties. So the CLP regulation is a version of the UN Globalized global harmonized system. And whilst they're from the same stable, the hazards are not exactly the same. There are some hazards that exist in GHS that are not present in CLP, and a few that are in CLP that are additional to GHS. This is really so that when CLP was developed in Europe, it kind of tried to stick to the previous legislation as closely as it could, whilst using the GHS building blocks. Some data sources, such as the IFRA-IFE labelling manual, have GHS classifications, not CLP, and this is because IFRA and IOFE are global organisations and not limited to the EU. So this means that the labelling manual may contain hazards that are not applicable in CLP. So the correct thing to do in Formpak is to add all the relevant GHS information and let Formpak do the calculations to give the correct CLP classification. If you only have CLP data from a CLP safety data sheet, that's fine. The data can still be added in the GHS hazards property group unless there are any CLP only hazards. So which property to add? So if you're looking at a safety data sheet, it might have the number of pictograms, signal words, hazards, as well as H codes and P codes. It's important that when you're adding hazards, you add the actual hazard code. Otherwise, all of the other parameters won't calculate correctly. So for example, if you added H300 at the top line of the blue, fatal if swallowed, it wouldn't calculate all the properties correctly. So what you should add is 8001 or 8002. This poster is free to download from the Formpak website and also the support center. So I'll demonstrate that when we get to the application, because we will be referring to it as we add some raw material examples. Physical versus regulatory. So this is a bit of an abstract concept, because in Formpak, when you add a raw material, there is only that one option, add a raw material. There isn't add a physical raw material or add a regulatory raw material. It's only how the raw materials are treated and whether they have a composition that determines whether the items are representing physical items or regulatory items. So here's a little bit of an example to help you consider the two different sections. If you buy a cake, that's a physical item. So you can go into a shop, you can buy a cake, you walk out with a cake. You can also go to a shop and buy the ingredients for a cake. So these are also physical items: flour, milk, eggs, butter. So if you're making a cake from flour, milk, eggs and butter, the ingredients are physical items of the cake, and the cake is also a physical item. So they appear in the recipe as the items to add. However, contained within the flour, milk, eggs and butter are fat, carbohydrates, protein, water, and these are regulatory items because they can't be separated out. You can't go into a shop and buy carbohydrates or protein content. They're kind of an intrinsic of the physical raw materials. So these are regulatory components of the ingredients, but also they're ultimately regulatory ingredients of the cake. So a regulatory composition of a raw material is quite similar to formulation composition, but it differs in one major way, which is that the composition parts do not need to total 100 in order for them to be treated as percentages. So it's actually very rare for a raw material composition to total 100 parts, because if, for example, you've got a natural complex substance, you maybe don't know 100% of what that material is. And if you, for example, add a raw material to represent a fragrance mixture, maybe you're an air care manufacturer and you've got the safety data sheet of a fragrance from a fragrance house, and the only information on the composition you have is a banded section in section 3. It's necessary that you add the highest values that are quoted in order that you capture the hazards correctly. So it's possible that your total will end up at more than 100 parts. But in Formpak, a raw material composition treats each entry as if it's a percentage, whether the total is more or less than 100 parts. That differs from a formulation composition, which is always calculated to be 100% however many parts have been added. So for example, in a formulation, if you have 20 parts of one item and 20 parts of another item and nothing else, both of those items are treated as if they are 50% of the formulation. If it's a raw material that's got 20 parts of one item and 20 parts of another and nothing else, each one of the items is treated as 20%. So here's our contact details: Support Manager Cheryl and Regulatory Manager Dave. We're now going to take a look in the Formpak application and add a few examples of raw materials. I'm going to start by showing you the support center. This will be familiar to many of you. If nothing else, you've been in quite a few presentations now. So here we have a search bar, and we can search for anything we're interested in and look at the various support articles there are for our search. There's also a number of training plans, including adding and managing raw materials. And these kind of arrange the existing support content into a meaningful flow. And as mentioned in the presentation, downloads, we have our GHS poster. So it's this column headed IFRIOFI LM abbreviation that contains the hazard codes that we'll be entering shortly. So I'm going to start by adding a simple raw material, i.e. one that has no composition, and this raw material represents a fairly straightforward chemical. So I have here a safety data sheet. And it's for sodium dodecyl sulfate. So the IFRIOFI labeling manual is a great source of data for raw materials used in flavors and fragrances, but it doesn't contain very much in ingredients for some of the associated industries, such as the cosmetics industry, for example. So this is a base used in cosmetic products, and so it doesn't already exist in our Formpak system. So I'm going to add it by adding the name. I'm going to give it an item class of chemical. And I'm going to manually assign a code. It is possible to set up code sequences, one or more code sequences for raw materials, and in this way it automates the process and ensures that all raw materials are added in a logical fashion. So the first tab we see is the Key Details tab. There's nothing much we want to add on here, except that we want this to be able to be used in complex raw materials. And also noting that because this item has the hazard flammable solid, it's fairly safe to assume that the state of the raw material is a solid. Then we're going to look at the identification tab, and here we can add various parameters. So we can add the cast number in. If there's any synonyms or EC number, FEMA number, they can be added here. We do have a REACH registration number for this product. This is not added in the identification tab, as that was a newer parameter than Formpak when Formpak started. That's now added as a property value rather than a field in the identification. The classification, as I mentioned earlier, is to do with the character class and notes. I wouldn't expect a cosmetic base ingredient to have any, but it's possible that it could. For example, emollient if it's a skin softener, that sort of thing. But for now, we'll leave those blank. Purchasing tab, if we have information on the supplier and the cost, this can be added here. And add the cost price. But mostly what we're interested in is the properties. So the hazard properties are shown in section 2. Any composition is shown in section 3 because this is a simple chemical. It doesn't have a composition, or rather it does, but it's 100% of a single chemical. So if we look at section 9, we can see the physical hazards. There's no flashpoint determined, presumably because this item is a solid, and you see the supplier's been reasonably lazy, and all they've supplied us with is an SG, specific gravity. So I add the name of the property in there and set it to its value. Okay. In addition to just showing the existing properties, we have the option here to show all properties within a property group. So in the physical data property group, we have all of these. And so if we have any data, we can add the data to these properties. Within the property group GHS hazards, there are none present at the minute, but we're going to add these in from section 2. So as I said before, it's important that we don't just add the H code. If your particular safety data sheet only shows H codes and not the what the actual hazards are, it's possible to look on the poster to determine what you need to be adding from this third column here based on the H code provided. So I need to be adding flammable solid 2, and it's possible to search either by code or name. So if I were to enter flammable solid, it would give us the same search results rather than just the code. This is a yes no property, so I just need to choose yes and add the next one. Acute toxicity oral 4. So if I'm not sure of what the code is, I look here on the poster and I see that acute toxicity 4, the code is 8004. So I'm going to add 8004, and there it is. TI4. SI2. My damaged one is EDI1. Specific target organ toxicity. Single exposure 3. So here we see that there's two options for STOSE3, NE and RI. So it's not possible to see from this hazard here which of those applies. However, if we look at the H code, we see here H335 may cause respiratory irritation. So that's probably a good candidate that it's RI. But if we double check on the poster, we see in the lightest blue section here that H335 refers to STOSE3 RI and H336 may cause drowsiness or dizziness refers to STOSE3 NE, which is narcotic effects. So RI is the one that we want in this case, and that's the one I've added. Also going to add the environmental EH chronic 3. I'm never done for adding the hazards. That's all the hazards there are. So in order to get the rest of the data, such as the signal word and the pictograms, I hit calculate now, and from these hazards, the rest of the properties are all calculated. So we can see the ones that were manually entered have no is calculated checked, and all the properties that have been calculated from them. So the danger signal word, the flame pictogram, the corrosion pictogram, the exclamation mark, all these other properties, including the H codes and the P codes, have all been calculated from those hazards. So there was one more property we wanted to add, and that was the REACH registration number. So here we can copy that from the data sheet. The REACH registration number is specific to your supply chain, so it's not possible to get the REACH registration number, for example, from the labeling manual, because it's specific to your supplier. So if I search in GHS hazards for the REACH number, I'm going to come up with a blank. It's not possible to add it there because it's not a GHS thing, it's a CLP thing. So we need to swap to CLP hazards. And in here, if we type REACH, we find the REACH registration number, and we can paste that property value in there. So once we're happy that we've added all the information we want, the next step is quite important, and that is to make properties determined yes. This is a human only step, so this is never calculated, and this is a human making a decision that I've added all the relevant data, and so when I save, that makes this item available to other users in Formpak and makes it possible to be added in formulations. If property is determined is kept at no and the item is saved, it's still visible in some instances, but it disallows the full calculation of any formulation that contains the raw material. So it's quite important to make sure it's checked as yes. if you see a formulation that has got a raw material that does not have properties determined, there'll be a question mark next to it in the composition. But for now, we've added that raw material successfully. Example 2 I wanted to demonstrate is, as I mentioned in the presentation, is copy from existing. So in this particular scenario, we've got a lavender oil from our supplier. It looks like a very similar supplier. It's certainly got the same logo. And if I view a raw material, that's existing. I can see we already have a lavender oil. However, this lavender oil isn't organic lavender oil. So I want to add a version that is representing this different grade of lavender oil, and I could add it as I did the previous raw material using just the information from the safety data sheet. However, it's a relatively long process. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to type add a new raw material, and I'm going to right click and open in a new tab. So they still have visibility on the first tab. And I'm going to add lavender oil organic. And this is going to be a fragrance raw material. And the code is going to be LAV003. And this is exactly the same starting process as when I added the cosmetic raw material a minute ago. This time, instead of changing anything on it, I'm just going to go and click copy from existing straight away. And I'm going to enter the lavender oil that we viewed, RM0060. And I'm going to click OK. Then we see that using complex raw materials has been automatically checked. Much of the identification has been automatically populated. Physical properties have been added. GHS hazards have been added and calculated. But also, we've got some purchasing data that's been added. Now, if this is a different grade of raw material, it's almost certain that it could be from a different supplier. So I'm going to change the supplier. And because it's organic, it's probably a lot more expensive than the regular lavender oil. So it's important to make sure that if you're using copy from existing, you then review all the data to make sure it's all relevant to the item you're adding. So I'm now going to check properties determined as yes and save. If I then view this raw material that we've just added, copied from the existing lavender oil, and view its composition, we can see that this looks slightly different. It only has 37% linalool acetate, whereas our data sheet states 40, and 31 linalool, and ours states 40. So what we probably need to do is modify a raw material composition. Again, I'm going to open that in a new tab. And we're going to modify the composition of LAV003. And we can make our composition look a bit more like the data sheet. Obviously, if you're lucky enough to have your own analytical equipment, that's data you can also use. For now, I'm not going to completely change this. I'm just going to save and check in. Save and check in is a similar process for compositions as checking properties determined as yes. There is an interim save button. If that's used, the item goes into work in progress rather than being made fully available to all departments. So save and check in is saying, yes, I want to save this and make it available for use in all departments. Preserve when exploding in this case is going to be no. So I just click OK and then we're saved and checked in. The last example I have of adding a raw material is a bit more complicated, and the scenario is that an air care company has purchased a fragrance and they've got some documentation for it, including a CLP safety data sheet, noting that section 3 is in percentage bands, but they've also sent an allergen declaration and an IFRA certificate. And the good thing about these documents is that these have data on the composition that is not banded. These have exact amounts. Typically, an allergen declaration will have exact amounts because the limits for labeling of allergens is so low in cosmetic products. It's quite important to have an accurate representation so that the labeling can be properly determined. So I start in exactly the same way, add a new raw material. And we want this to be used in complex raw materials because we're going to have to make a further use of it. In the identification tab, we don't have cast numbers or chemical names, so there's nothing much to add here. It's possible to add purchasing information, and it's also possible to add properties. However, I'm going to wait until after we've added the composition because the hazards will be calculated from the components rather than adding the hazards in manually. So I'm leaving properties determined as no, so that no one can use this raw material whilst I'm adding the composition. And I'm going to save it as it is. So I've made very little changes to that. I'm then going to add composition to this raw material. Formpak often offers useful next step links in the application here, but all of these are always available in the menu bar if we wanted to, for example, go here to add composition to raw material. We don't have to rely on the links that come up. So here we see DL citronellol is 10 to 20%. If that was the only data we had, we should add 20% DL citronellol. However, because we have an allergen list, we can see that we have an exact amount of DL citronellol here, 15.25. So it's possible for me to add the CAS number for DL citronellol. Nothing comes up until you click deep search. If you search for codes and names, they automatically pop up. Deep search is required for CAS numbers. Here we see we have a range of options with that CAS number. It's important that the correct item is added. For example, in this system, we have a couple of duplicates, but it's important that we're adding a comp item to represent the component rather than the IFRA code. IFRA items in Formpak typically just have the IFRA standard information for an item and don't have any of the hazards. So if we were to add the IFRA item citronellol, we probably wouldn't get any of the GHS CLP hazards that are associated with it. So I'm going to add the comp code and add the exact amount of 15.25. I can then hit enter to add the next line. There's also add, insert, delete, undo and redo up here for ease of navigation. So I can search by name. I'm going to put the limonene in, DL limonene 14.45. Another 1.2. Isoeugenol 0.2. Aniol 0.262. And citral 0.492. So that's all the data added from the allergen declaration. In the IFRA, we also have the citral. That's already been added, so we don't need to add it again. And there's some safrole. So I add that as a component there. So then it's a case of looking what we have here in the data sheet. So we've already added the citronellol. Here we have dipropylene glycomonomethyl ether. I'm going to paste the CAS number in there and find this raw material. So here we don't have any option but to add the highest percentage. So it's possible to make the best guess at a formulation from kind of mixed sources. If you have some data that's exact amounts and some that's not exact amounts, it's fine to mix them up because it gets you the closest possible match to the item. If we get an item that we don't have any result for, in this case, I've got deep search checked, but it's still not finding this CAS number. So what we may need to do in this instance is add a raw material to represent this menthone that's not appearing because we don't have it already in our system. So we don't have to leave the composition that we're currently adding. We can just add a new raw material up here from the left-hand menu, go into new tab, and we can do this process here of adding a new raw material in real time. And we have very little data about this raw material other than the fact that we have the CAS number. We have an EC number. And we have its classification, which is aquatic chronic 3. So in the GHS hazards, we're going to put EHC3 and make that yes. There is an ATE for oral acute toxicity. However, because that value is so high, 2,500, that's out of scope of the oral toxicity for CLP, so I'm not going to add it this time. Going to set properties determined to yes, calculate the hazards. That's going to add in all the relevant information, H codes, P codes. I can save that. And then going back to my original tab here, if I now research for this CAS number, the item I've just added is available. So I could continue to add this composition, but that's a bit dull. So I'm just going to save and check in as if I've completed that. And then the composition's all good. What we need to then do is go back to modify this raw material, because we didn't set properties determined to yes, and we didn't check the physical properties to see what data we have. So here we have flash point greater than 65. So I'm just going to add that in on the property FP. Greater than 65. I'm not going to bother with the vapor pressure, although you probably should. Okay, and set properties determined to yes, and save. That concludes the example raw materials.